College. So it's a great honour and privilege to have Lord Bilimoria with us this evening, who's going to talk to us about Brexit, the sword hanging over the universities. So, Lord Bilimoria.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you so much. And it's a real privilege to be with all of you, and I'm very grateful to Kellogg College for appointing me the Bynum Tudor Fellow for the academic year 2017-18. Do you need this? Are you hearing me clearly without this? Yes, everyone can hear me clearly? Yeah. Maybe it's just, thank you so much. Thank you, John. It's very grateful to be the Bynum Tudor Fellow for the academic year 2017-18, and it's a great honour and a privilege. I'm also humbled to be following in the footsteps of former Bynum Tudor Fellows, including my friend and colleague in the House of Lords, Lord David Putnam, and the Nobel laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a honorary fellow at Sydney Sussex College at the University of Cambridge. We address ourselves as fellow in our correspondence. I'm extremely grateful to the President, Professor John Smitty, and to Professor Yasmin Khan. Is Yasmin here somewhere? There you are, Yasmin, for welcoming me to the college last month and for their guidance and advice. So thank you very much. I've already had the privilege of interacting with our brilliant and diverse international students. A group of 18 visited me in the House of Lords, and we had an excellent discussion. Are there any of the 18 here today? Oh, there we are. Good to see you again. And what was great about that is also because of Kellogg and the courses that we have and the students coming from literally all over the world, amongst that group of 18 was a great opportunity for you to meet each other when you may not have, your paths may not have crossed. So that was very nice to bring you together. And I'm looking forward to hosting further groups each term next year. Recently, on a visit to the northeastern state of Bihar in India, where Cobra Beer and our joint venture partner Molson Coors own a brewery, I went to visit the site of the ruins of the ancient Indian university Nalanda. Walking through, you could imagine the cloisters, the quadrangles, or the courts, as one would say at Cambridge. Nalanda University was founded in the 5th century BC, but sadly was attacked in the 13th century. Ransacked by Bakhtiyar Khilji. It is ironic that at the same time this ancient university shut down in the 13th century, Oxford and Cambridge were being established. Today, relative to Nalanda, our relatively modern ancient universities are consistently considered to be two of the finest universities in the world. And in the latest Times Higher Education World Rankings, Oxford was ranked first in the world and Cambridge fourth. In fact, British universities on the whole are the finest in the world, along with the United States of America. This is in spite of America being 5 times larger than Britain as a country, and leading American universities having far higher financial resources. I'm an alumnus of the Harvard Business School through executive education. The Harvard endowment now stands at $38 billion, compared with Oxford's endowment of £5 billion and Cambridge's of £6 billion. Furthermore, America spends approximately double the percentage of GDP on higher education than we do here in the UK. Although the levels of benefaction are increasingly significantly in the UK, with Oxford and Cambridge leading the way, each having embarked on £2 billion campaigns, we're still a long way away from the giant benefactions in the United States, where, for example, in 2014, $350 million was donated by Mr. Gerald Chan to found the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. So there's no question that both Oxford and Cambridge punch above their weight. Other universities in the UK are also following suit. At the University of Birmingham, where I'm Chancellor, my predecessor, Sir Dominic Cadbury, headed a fundraising campaign of £160 million, which has reached almost £200 million today. the largest for a British university outside Oxford and Cambridge. But are we appreciated by the government and by the public? Are our universities a priority for the government? In the hugely hyped industrial strategy released on Monday this week, which unfortunately for the government was completely overshadowed by the excitement of the announcement of the engagement of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, who I've had the privilege of meeting, universities hardly featured. When according to UUK, universities contribute almost £100 billion to the UK economy and hardly featured in the government's industrial strategy. With the focus currently on Britain's poor performance with regard to productivity, it is our universities producing highly educated and highly skilled graduates which are the most important solution to increasing productivity, and yet they barely featured in the industrial strategy. Are universities appreciated by the public? Currently, there is a furor over university vice-chancellors' pay. With only yesterday the announcement of the resignation of the Vice-Chancellor of Bath, who I know, the highest paid university Vice-Chancellor in the country. University Vice-Chancellors of our leading universities are chief executives of institutions turning over hundreds of millions of pounds. At Birmingham, for example, the turnover is soon going to be £700 million. In the case of Oxford and Cambridge, £1.5 billion each. And university vice-chancellors, along with Oxford and Cambridge, are responsible for property, land and buildings worth several £billion in many cases, managing tens of thousands of staff, tens of thousands of students, and yet the average pay package of a FTSE 100 chief executive is £4.5 million a year, 10 times that of the highest paid university vice-chancellor in the country. Universities support up to 1 million jobs in the UK, and when it comes to research papers, Britain, with less than 1% of the world's population, generates 16% of the world's most highly cited research articles. And yet we as a country spend 1.7% of our GDP on research and development and innovation versus America and Germany at 2.7%. The government has recently spoken of increasing investment in R&D and innovation by £2 billion a year, which is very welcome. However, for us to catch up annually with Germany or America, we would need to invest an additional £20 billion a year, 10 times more than the £2 billion the government is investing, let alone making up for the underinvestment over the past years. And then when it comes to our universities being global, it is not just our reputation that is global. We attract the third highest number of international students in the world after America and Australia. I'm proud to be president of UKISA, the UK Council of International Student Affairs, helping to look after the 450,000 international students in the UK. International students contribute £26 billion to our economy. And they support 200,000 jobs in the UK. They enrich the experience of our domestic students, and they form generation-long links between the UK and their home countries. The University of Birmingham recently prepared an impact report which outlines how every 8 international undergraduates generated £1 million to the economy. This is a similar figure for other Russell Group universities, every 7 or 8 undergraduates, international, generating £1 million. I'm the third generation of my family to be educated in the UK on both sides of my family. My father's father was at Sandhurst. He was one of the few Indians, we were still in the midst of commemorating the First World War's centenary. And in the First World War, 1 million Indians served. And the only ones allowed to be officers were the medics, the doctors. All the others served in the ranks. They were not allowed to be officers. And if you think about it, without the 1 million volunteers from India, I don't think we'd be sitting here having this lecture in the way that we are. without the 2.5 million and more that served in the Second World War. I was chairman of the Memorial Gates in London, Constitution Hill, near Hyde Park Corner. That is a memorial to the 5 million who served from the Indian subcontinent, from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Africa and the Caribbean. And in the roof, inside the roof of the pavilion, are engraved the names of the Victoria Cross and George Cross holders. And for my late father, Lieutenant General Bilimoria's battalion, the 2nd 5th Gurkha Rifles Frontier Force, 3 Victoria Crosses in the Second World War from one battalion, and the names are up inside that pavilion. So when the First World War finished, the Empire then said, oh, we better let a few of these Indians become officers. And from 1922 until 1936, for a very short period, until the Indian Military Academy was founded in Dehradun in India, where my father was commissioned, in that short period of just over 10, 12 years, they allowed 8 Indians per course at Sandhurst. It's highly competitive. And my grandfather was one of those 8 during that period. And it's a very short list of King's commissioned officers. So he was at Sandhurst in the early 1930s. And my mother's father was at the University of Birmingham at the same time. They met each other as students in the UK, as fellow Zoroastrian Parsis, of which there aren't many in the world. There are less than 100,000 Zoroastrian Parsis in the world, less than 59,000 in India out of 1.25 billion people. And yet you go to India and anyone knows who a Zoroastrian Parsi is. There are less than 6,000 of us here out of 65 million. And of course, the famous Zoroastrian Parsis, the Tatars, who now own Jaguar Land Rover, and Tata Steel, Zubin Mehta, the conductor, Freddie Mercury of Queen, all Zoroastrian Parsis, a tiny community. So they met each other, my grandfathers. Little did they realize that some decades later they would become in-laws. My mother attended the University of Birmingham. Her brother did his PhD at the University of Birmingham, and I graduated from a British university the other place. And now my son is at a British university 4 generations. International students are one of our country's strongest elements of soft power, with a recent survey showing that amongst the over 300 serving heads of state and heads of government, 58 in the whole world attended universities and colleges in the UK more than any other country in the world, including the United States. I joined the House of Lords 11 years ago, and I was one of the handful of youngest peers then. I'm still one of the youngest peers. Our average age is almost 70. In 2007, I led the charge in Parliament to introduce the 2-year post-graduation work visa for international students. This was implemented in 2008 and led to a significant increase in international students. Having been an international student myself, I appreciate the value in allowing international students to work for 2 years to help pay for their education, to contribute to our economy, to pay taxes, and to build further links and bridges with our country. When the coalition government was formed in 2010, the 2-year post-graduation work visa was removed in 2012. And now, although foreign graduates can work after they graduate, it's frankly very difficult and hardly any do. We're competing with other countries. While the demand for studying abroad from countries like India is increasing at 8% a year. Countries around the world are competing to attract international students, and our direct competitors, the United States of America, Canada, Australia, all allow international students to work automatically for a period after they graduate. Over and above this, our government insists on categorizing international students as immigrants. The government has a target to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. By treating international students as immigrants and including them in the net migration figures, we send out the message and the perception that Britain wants to reduce the number of international students. We have a Prime Minister who, when she was Home Secretary for 6 years, stated that she wanted international students to leave the day they graduated. The headlines in India, one newspaper, "Take our money and get out." We have tried in Parliament, where before the election in June this year, within the Higher Education Bill in the House of Lords, we defeated the government by 100 votes and have been trying to legislate the stopping of international students being categorized as immigrants in net migration figures. Our competitor countries exclude them from their calculations, treating them as temporary visitors. Furthermore, the Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary and thereafter, regularly stated that 100,000 international students overstayed each year. I've been saying for many years that the governments, this government, coalition government, Labour government before that, have all lost control over immigration, including illegal immigration. The recently retired head of the Borders Agency just said that he believes there are over 1 million illegal immigrants in the UK. I've been saying for years that we've lost control of our borders. No one checks your passport when you leave the United Kingdom. Every other country you travel to, including every European country that I travel to in the EU, they check your passport when you enter the country and they check your passport when you leave the country. That applies to the United States of America, it applies to South Africa, to India. This summer, just after Parliament went into recess, the government announced that the International Passenger Survey used for calculating immigration statistics should be treated as experimental. Note, they did this just after we went into recess. Again, later on in the recess, the government announced that it carried out a more accurate analysis of overstaying international students, and far from the 100,000 Project Fear figure emanating from the Prime Minister, the actual number of overstaying international students was only 4,500. 100,000, 4,500. We need to bring back visible, physical exit checks at our borders. And we need to stop having this attitude. It seems absolutely baffling that the Prime Minister and the government have such a negative attitude towards international students. We're losing out day by day. The number of students from India has halved since 2010. They're instead going to countries like Australia, who are welcoming them. The newly appointed Australian High Commissioner to India told me on a visit there, she said, "What are you doing in the UK with international students? They're all coming to us." She said, "We welcome them. If somebody is paying to come to our country, paying us money, spending as an undergraduate 3 years, or whatever time they spend studying in Australia, they learn about Australia, they learn about our country. If they want to stay on and work, if they want to stay on forever, they're welcome. They've passed any hoops that we would have for anyone entering our country. They've paid to be educated here. We welcome them." And we have exactly the opposite attitude. In fact, Australia has a Minister for International Students. Australia has a target to increase international students to 720,000 by 2020 from the 550,000 in 2016. They've already overtaken us. And we're not only competing with English-speaking countries, but also European countries, specifically Germany, France, Holland, and Sweden. France, for example, has a target to double the number of international students from India by 2020. We have no such targets. And within the 450,000 international students in the UK, EU students number 130,000. At the University of Oxford, 15.5% of our students here are from the EU. At Kellogg College, Oxford's newest college, founded exactly when Cobra beer was founded in 1990, 14.6% of the students are from the EU. And it's not just the students. At our leading universities, 39% of academic staff are from overseas, and at Russell Group universities, 21% are from the European Union. At Kellogg, 20% of our fellows are from the European Union. EU students in the UK are entitled to home student status, paying the same fees as home students, as well as being eligible for the home student loan. If we leave the European Union, will European students continue to be treated as such? And if not, there are 130,000 students at stake who are worth billions of pounds to our economy, let alone everything else they bring to our universities. Quite apart from students and academics, our universities receive huge amounts of EU funding, including Horizon 2020. Cambridge alone receives almost £100 million. If we leave the EU, the government has tried to reassure us that they will replace this funding. But it's not just the funding. More importantly, a huge amount of research which is carried out collaboratively with European universities. The power of collaborative research is phenomenal. For example, when I accompanied the University's Minister Joe Johnson to India a year ago, the University of Birmingham demonstrated this power through results of joint research carried out with the University of Punjab. The field-weighted citation impact of the University of Punjab on its own is 1.37. The University of Birmingham field-weighted citation impact is 1.87. 1.37, 1.87. The co-authored publications reach an average weighted impact of 5.64. 3 times each individual institution. We compared this with the University of Harvard collaborating with the University of Birmingham. Okay, Harvard is Harvard. Their field-weighted impact is 2.4. Birmingham, 1.87. Combined, 5.69. Much higher, but here is the possibility. Punjab, Birmingham, 5.64. Birmingham, Harvard, 5.69. It is so powerful, and we risk losing all this if we leave the EU. Already we hear story after story of European universities not wanting to collaborate with British universities because of the uncertainty of Brexit. Our EU academics are extremely worried about their future status, and of course the uncertainty of Brexit is deterring the high-quality EU academics which British universities have always attracted and so desperately need and appreciate. Sadly, the 3.6 million EU citizens who live and work in the UK have been treated as political bargaining chips in the Brexit negotiations. The Brexiteers have said that these people are a burden on our public services. The reality is that they're not a burden. Many of them are young and do not use the NHS as much. They're not only extremely hardworking, willing to leave their families thousands of miles away and come to the UK, learn the language, work hard, pay taxes, contribute to our economy 6 times more than they take out. They work in just every area, not just unskilled as Brexiteers would have you believe, but across the board, be it agricultural workers, hospitality industry, 200,000 in the construction industry. If my neighbour Sajid Javed wants more houses built, how will he build them without the EU workforce? The City of London, highly skilled EU citizens, and of course academics at our universities, and I could go on. And of course when it comes to the public sector, which they're meant to be a burden on, there are 130,000 EU citizens working in the NHS and care homes, including doctors and nurses. Recently we discovered that there's been a 96% drop in EU nurses registering to work in Britain, and only yesterday the government has announced that it needs to recruit 5,000 new nurses from India and the Philippines because of a shortage of nurses. The UK currently has 4.3% unemployment, the lowest figure in almost 4 decades. The reality is that without the 3.6 million EU citizens working in the UK, we would have an acute labour shortage. On the other hand, we're talking about these EU citizens making up 5% of our overall population in this country, of 65 million, 66 million. How on earth can 5% crowd out 95%? It is this 5% that we should be grateful for and appreciative as a nation. I've always been very clear that I'm a Eurosceptic in many ways. I do not like the way the EU Parliament works, the fact that it has to sit in Brussels and go to Strasbourg every month for a week just to keep the French happy. I mean, what a waste of time and money. The members of the EU Parliament have no connection with the areas they represent. I don't know many people who know who their MEPs are. I haven't a clue who mine are. There's no representation. There's no accountability. Unlike our members of Parliament, who know their constituents who know who they are, there's direct representation and accountability. The euro is a huge mistake. One size cannot fit all, unless there's a true federal United States of Europe with fiscal union. I don't think there will ever be a United States of Europe, a true federal country such as the United States of America or India. And the only person who's managed to unite Europe was Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th century with the cross and the sword. With Schengen, I used to think Britain lost out by not being members to business and tourist visitors. And now, because of the migration crisis and from a security point of view, we're better off not being in Schengen. But looking back, Britain as a member of the EU has, in the words of our court jester, our foreign secretary, had the best of both worlds. We have had our cake and we have eaten it. We're not in the euro, we're not in Schengen. We continue to drive on the left-hand side of the road. We measure our roads in miles and we fill our cars in litres. I sell Cobra beer in litres on the supermarket shelves, but I pour it in pints as draft beer because I want to. We have had the best of both worlds. We have been having our cake and eating it too. And we've done well economically as members of the European Union. It would surprise most people that of the original EU countries, when the European Union was formed, I'm not talking about the EEC, I'm talking about the European Union, Germany, who you'd expect to have the highest cumulative GDP growth, has 35%. The UK, 62%. We have done well out of being members of the European Union. In February 2016, when the referendum was announced by David Cameron, Britain was the fastest growing economy in the Western world and we were flying. Today, less than a year and a half since the wretched referendum, the EU has a faster growth rate and Britain has the lowest growth rate in the G7. Furthermore, we've had the OBR in the budget last week, providing us with the worst economic growth forecast in our history, with 5 years of growth predicted at under 2% a year each year, all as a result of Brexit. Britain is the highest recipient of inward investment in Europe by far, and Britain is the second largest recipient of inward investment in the world. Countries like India treat the UK as the gateway to the EU, and many companies use the UK as their European headquarters. Already, companies are looking to relocate abroad in the EU from the UK. And in the words of the chairman of Goldman Sachs, I'll be spending a lot more time here when he was in Frankfurt, was the tweet that he sent out. The Brexiteers' mantra is, we're leaving the EU, now Britain truly go global, and we can trade more with the Commonwealth, and we can have free trade agreements all over the world as a result of Brexit and leaving the EU. I spoke in a debate on the Commonwealth in the House of Lords this week, and I outlined the reality. The Commonwealth, over 50 countries, 51 countries, including countries like India, makes up less than 10% of Britain's trade. Europe, 44% of our exports, 55% of our imports, 50% of our overall trade. This is nothing unusual. Countries tend to trade with countries nearby. The Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement, CETA, took 8 years to complete, but the EU is only 10% of Canada's trade. Who's Canada's biggest partner? Naturally, the United States of America next door. And in our case, apart from the 50% of our trade with the EU through the single market and the customs union, we also have 17% in addition through free trade agreements that the EU has with over 50 countries around the world. And on top of that, Japan has just agreed a free trade agreement with the EU. So that means 17 plus Japan, taking it up to almost 20, plus the 50 that we already have with the EU. So with and through the EU, we have 70% of our global trade. So by leaving the EU, are we going to sacrifice that 70% and go after that 30%, which includes countries like India? Do you know how many free trade agreements India has with any countries in the world? 9, and not one with a Western country. Only last week, the Indian High Commissioner said, and he said this sort of thing regularly, yes, India would be happy to talk about an FTA, but maybe it'll be ready by 2030. He also said, and I said this before, that it's not just about goods and tariffs, but it's also about the movement of people, including the movement of Indian professionals to the UK, and of course of Indian students. And when I was in India on the Prime Minister's visit a year ago, in November, in the first speech, when she and Prime Minister Modi, in the opening speeches of her visit, she didn't mention international students once. She didn't mention immigration publicly once. The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, one of the most powerful people in the world, in a very humble way said in his speech that the movement of our people is very important, including our youth. And just before the Prime Minister flew out to India, Britain announced it was increasing the minimum wage for foreign workers by 50%. And one of India's biggest exports are IT services. So immediately, Indian IT workers' salaries minimum was going to go up by 50%, making them far less competitive. Is that going to help you do free trade deals with India? And then, in the bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister spoke to him of returning overstaying Indians from Britain. Great way to make friends. So that's the reality of FTAs with countries like India. Of course, the question of how much it costs us to be part of the EU, the net contribution, is not the £350 million on the side of the Brexit battle bus. It's actually between 8 to 10 billion pounds a year. This is just 1% of our annual government expenditure of £800 billion a year. On a pie chart, if you show government expenditure, it's a fine line and you have to point an arrow showing Britain's annual contribution to the EU. I would pay that money for the peace that we've had in Europe over the past decades because of the EU and because of NATO. And when it comes to taking back control of our laws, let's take back control. Whenever I ask businesses or consumers, what are the laws that concern them, that are supposedly controlled by Europe, most people cannot even name one. And I have seen in my 11 years in Parliament that the laws that affect us on a day-to-day basis are legislated in Parliament here in the UK. Be it our taxes, be it our planning laws, be it our universities. To conclude, Brexit is a huge mistake. It is a sword hanging over our universities, be it our students, academics, our research. The behaviour of the government has been threatening our democracy, with the Prime Minister trying to bypass Parliament to trigger Article 50, taking an individual to defeat the government in the High Court and the Supreme Court, supported by my brilliant crossbench colleague, Lord Panic, Fellow of All Souls. Government defeated in the High Court and Supreme Court and was forced to go through Parliament. And there in the House of Lords, we had two of the biggest votes in the history of the House of Lords, with 634 peers and 614 peers voting. And in each of them, we defeated the government by approximately 100 votes. That is one of the main reasons we had the election in June, that we can talk about that in the question answers. And now the government is trying to put through the Great Repeal Bill with Henry VIII powers once again bypassing Parliament. What is more, that I've seen another huge aspect of this country that has been threatened by Brexit. When I came to the UK for my education in the early 1980s, the UK was the sick man of Europe, with no respect in the global economy. It was looked upon as a has-been, a country which had the biggest empire the world has ever known. I was told by my family and friends, if you decide to work after you finish your studies in Britain, just remember you'll never get to the top because there will be a glass ceiling and you will not be allowed to get to the top as a foreigner. I'm sorry to say that they were right at that time. I have seen that glass ceiling shattered over the past years. I've seen this country become a country of aspiration and opportunity, where anyone can get anywhere regardless of race, religion, or background. And I've gone so far as to say that as a result of this transformation, I believe that we will see an Asian as Prime Minister of this country in my lifetime. This, of course, has already happened in Ireland. But above all, this Brexit has already damaged our standing in the world. Britain was respected as a global power at the top table of the world, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, an influential member of NATO, G7, G8, G20, top table of the EU, as one of the two largest economies in the European Union. Today, we've already lost our standing, lost our say in Europe, because the whole world, except for Donald Trump, believes that Britain should remain in the European Union. I've hosted delegations of senior Indian civil servants, including at permanent secretary level. Recently, I hosted a group where I asked them, how many of you think we should remain in the European Union? 100% of the hands went up. And then one of them said, we feel sorry for you. It's a bad time, but it's not too late. Last year, for the first time in my 3.5 decades in this country, in the build-up to the referendum and afterwards, and to this day, I received racist hate mail that I'd never received once before. Tweets, emails, letters running into several pages, things I cannot repeat in a lecture like this and on a platform like this. This not only hurt me a great deal, but has worried me that the process that has led to this wonderful country being one of the most open in the world, with the 5th largest economy in the world, going from the sick man of Europe to the envy of Europe, a truly multicultural country with London, the most multicultural and vibrant city in the world, with all these wonderful achievements, seeing the clock turn backwards. It is now at this critical juncture in the history of Britain that we cannot allow that clock to turn back. And for the benefit of our country, our economy, our institutions, our universities, our businesses, and our citizens, it would be best if Britain does not leave the European Union and remains in the European Union. I believe that this will evolve over the coming months as the British people realize that the Brexit emperor has no clothes. Only yesterday, a poll has come out saying that there's a record high of 47% saying that they thought that Britain was wrong to vote to leave the European Union, coupled with a record low of 42% saying we were right to do so. This will only increase as people are more informed of the realities of Brexit, and I believe that respecting the will of the people is not holding them to a democratic vote that took place 1.5 years ago, where people voted to leave but not exactly on what basis. Really respecting democracy would be to ask people, when there is a deal or no deal, would you want to leave on that basis? That would be respecting democracy and a truly democratic vote, allowing people to change their mind, and those not old enough in 2016 to vote to have their say at that time. It is, after all, our youth and generations to come who are our future, and I know that through Brexit they feel that their future is being taken away from them, and they must have a voice in their future. I conclude by reading my favorite poem written by the Indian Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore, which is so apt. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Thank you very much.